To every industry, there's always a brand or company that you would associate with it. And usually, that company is not the first. But because it did it better, it stole the crown. For example, Disneyland was not the first theme park ever, it just did it better. Or the iPhone. It wasn't the first smartphone. So when it comes to video games, the crown has sort of been thrown around for a couple decades. Of course now Sony sits on top of the huge empire, and it probably won't lose its crown for a very long time. Well, but of course the first one to hold this crown was Atari. Atari truly was the Disney or Apple of the time, as there were other consoles like the Magnavox Odyssey, but Atari's brand just took a skyrocket and unfortunately plummeted. So let's see why Atari entered the Red Ring of Death. In 1971, when video games were sort of a fetus at the time, Nolan Bushnell, who I have actually mentioned before in a cringy, old, stupid fucking video. Basically, he also founded Chuck E. Cheese, just to keep it short. And Ted Dabney made an engineering company called Syzygy, I guess so. Syzygy Engineering. They made Computer Space, the first ever arcade video game. And only a year later, they were like, because why not, let's change the name to Atari. So Atari wanted a design engineer, so they recruited Al Alcorn, real name. Real person. And he was requested to make a arcade version of the Magnavox Odyssey's game Tennis, which of course, as we all know today, is called Pong. The mid-70s came along, and in 1976 a console was born called the Atari Video Computer. It was renamed to the 2600 after the 5200's release. The console costed $200, which sounds pretty cheap for a new console, but it's actually like $840 in today's money. Even though Atari was doing really well, they were not exactly big. So they needed a little bit of help with marketing. So Bushnell sold Atari to Warner Communications for $30 million. But him and Warner didn't really have the best relationship with each other. And they had many disagreements. In fact, Bushnell was fired because he disagreed so much with Warner. This is pretty foreshadowing and ironic to Steve Jobs, how he hired like a board and they fired him from his own company, except Steve Jobs returns. Bushnell even said himself that him and Warner were fighting like cats and dogs. It was just total madness. So Warner continued and released the 5200 in 1982. And if you've watched The Angry Video Game Nerd, you will know that this console failed terribly. It only had a small amount of good games, no backwards compatibility with the 2600, and unreliable controls. But the 2600 would continue to be Atari's good product. And in fact, it was so successful, it made Warner the fastest growing company in the US at the time. But this would be short-lived, as the video game and arcade division worked independently and rarely worked together. And communication is extremely important. There was also a lot of competition, and there were tons of other consoles. I guess you could say how there's tons of smartphones these days, like so many you just can't even count. Back in the day, there were tons and tons of consoles. There aren't just like 3 like you can choose today. And games were just becoming boring to people. So due to that factor, in 1983, the video game crash came. In total, the industry lost $500 million, and Warner's stock fell from $60 a share to $20. But don't worry, because then just a little bit later, it would just get worse. The Nintendo Famicom came around, and Atari and many other companies began to fall. James J. Morgan wanted to reconstruct the company and worked together with Warner Communications to make NATCO, which stood for New Atari Company. Little to their knowledge, but Warner was talking with Tramiel Technology to buy Atari Consumer Electronics and Home Computer Division. And on July 1st of 1984, Drac Tramiel bought Atari for $240 million in promissory notes and stocks. Warner only owned 20% of Atari, but they still owned the arcade division, and that was sold to Namco in 1985. Warner also sold the Atari Tel. Yes, a phone with the name Atari on it. It was sold to Mitsubishi. I can never say that company's name right. Like, I know how to say it, but like when I say it, whatever. For a while, Atari lived off of the remaining stocks available from the consoles. while they were still developing the next big thing, which was the Atari ST, which stood for 1632, or in other words, it's a 32-bit computer. In April of 1985, Atari released the Atari 65XE in their new XE series. Later that year, though, they finally released the 32-bit Atari ST, and in 1986, Atari returned to the console game and released the Atari 2600 Junior and the 7800. Atari made $25 million in profit that year. To compete with the Game Boy and the upcoming Game Gear, Atari released the Lynx, but due to a shortage of parts, it didn't hit that 1989 Christmas season, and the Game Boy took over the shelf space. Atari then had a brilliant idea on how to make money, so they sued Nintendo for $250 million, claiming that it had an illegal monopoly, and their case was rejected in 1992. In 1993, Atari fought back the SNES and Genesis with the Jaguar. It was the first 64-bit console, and the marketing was pretty good actually. Its slogan was famously, "Do the math." But that still failed. Some of the games were not good, and they didn't even look like they were 64-bit, so Atari just ended up flopping. After that, Atari did not make any more consoles. Well, besides the flashbacks. And for a while, there was no American company in the gaming industry until Microsoft would come in. But Atari still had some money because it did win some lawsuits with other situations. But unfortunately, without a console, Atari had nothing to sell. In July of 1996, Atari merged with JTS, a short-lived hard drive disk driver manufacturer. But JTS sold Atari in March of 1998 to Hasbro Interactive for $5 million. Which was only a fifth of what Atari was sold for back in 1976. In December of 2000, while the PS2 was just killing all the other small consoles and stuff, genocide just like episode 3, Hasbro was taken over by Infogrammers. 8 years later, in 2008, Infogrammers offered Atari to buy them in total for $11 million, which when you think about it, it's pretty sad, because someone like PewDiePie, who is not really that rich when you think about it, would have the ability to buy Atari. Even though Atari is out of the console market, it's now back in the console market, because a week ago Atari announced that they will be unveiling a new console. Yes, you heard me right, this is the trailer for this new console. So is it a flashback? Is it a NES Classic? Well, we don't know much about it. All that Atari said is that there's going to be PC components, and that's it. Many people believe that this is actually going to be like a console that's going to compete against the PS4 Pro and the Xbox One X and the Nintendo Switch, and honestly, I don't see it happening. I don't think that it's going to be possible, and I fear for Atari that this will kill them. They haven't been in the console market for 24 years, and a lot has changed. Godspeed, Atari. Godspeed. So anyways, that is it, and I will see you guys in the next one.